The streets were filled with the loud screams of Gordon riots, which was the protest against Roman Catholic emancipation led by Lord George Gordon. In certain parts of the city, few children were observed walking with crooked legs, yet the cause remained unknown, as the occurrence was rare. It was so rare that it wasn't even documented by any medical professional. Michael Underwood, who was a pediatrician in London, published a medical textbook in 1789 about diseases in children, where the condition was mentioned as a debility of the lower extremities. According to Underwood, the condition was usually seen in children who had suffered from fever recently, and the symptom would gradually lead to paralysis. Due to the primitive medical practices at the moment, there was no answer to the disease. This would mark the early days of an epidemic that would haunt the 20th century, with its after-effects visible till this date. After the initial recognition of the condition by Underwood, it was assigned various names, such as Underwood's disease and infantile paralysis, representing whom it affected and what it did. No one knew if the disease could spread among other individuals or it was just a genetic defect. The condition remained relatively unnoticed for several decades until an outbreak emerged in 1868 in Norway. Around the same time, the notion began to surface that the previously rare cases of infantile paralysis might be contagious. Before significant research could be conducted, the next significant outbreak erupted in the state of Vermont in 1894. The outbreak continued to escalate, resulting in approximately 1,031 cases in Sweden by 1905. During this period, two significant discoveries were made over the span of a few decades. Firstly, Eva Wickman recognized that patients with non-paralytic disease could transmit the virus. Secondly, Carl Kling recovered the virus from both healthy carriers and paralytic patients. Upon further research, it was determined that the virus resides in victims' throat and tissues of intestines. The virus was unique. It would multiply within the host's digestive system, but only 5% of them would ever develop symptoms. Over time, the disease was given the name poliomyelitis, or polio in short. Polio was found to be transmitting primarily from fecal-oral route, which occurs when a healthy individual ingests fecal matter from the infected hosts. As nasty as it might sound, this transaction primarily occurs through contaminated water source and unsanitary practices. Industrial revolution was at its full swing, and population was concentrated at specific cities. As the primary transmission method was possible due to poor sanitation and unmanaged sewer system, you might think that individuals with high priority for sanitation were safe, but that wasn't the case. It's a paradox of medical history that the transformation of polio into an epidemic disease occurred solely in those industrialized countries in North America and Europe that had undergone substantial improvements in hygiene during the 19th and 20th centuries. Polio had become a widespread disease by the late 19th century, yet only 5% of infected individuals exhibited visible symptoms, making it impossible to accurately trace the number of infections. When an infected mother had a baby in her womb, the baby was able to acquire polio-targeting antibodies from mother's immune system and be under its protection while being nursed after birth. In many cases, these antibodies prevented a baby from developing symptoms of polio while allowing their immune system to generate its own antibodies. However, this strategy would only be effective if the baby encountered the virus within a month after birth. But this scenario was less likely to occur in places with good sanitary practices. Despite identifying the virus, humanity faced a significant obstacle in the search for a cure. The lack of advanced electron microscopes, which were not invented and mass-produced until the 1940s, hindered scientists' ability to closely examine the virus. While efforts were being made to understand the virus, New York was struck with an epidemic of 9,000 cases, where 2,000 were fatal. Widespread panic was inevitable, and public places in the city were shut down, with residents fleeing to countryside. Due to the severity of the disease, infected individuals were subjected to strict quarantine measures. The homes of polio victims were marked with ominous cards, forbidding any contact with the outside world. As winter arrived, the disease seemed to have faded away, but a troubling pattern emerged. Every summer, polio resurfaced, haunting communities across the United States and Western Europe, infecting more victims than before. Adults and especially children were dying, and the only thing doctors could say was to keep children out of crowds and stay home to avoid contagion. With time, it was identified that the virus inflicted damage on the central nervous system, especially the motor neurons, which was the root cause for paralysis. If the motor neuron sustained minimal damage, the individual would escape with crippled limbs or experience non-paralytic polio. However, severe damage to the nervous system would lead to paralysis of the diaphragm, rendering breathing impossible for the victim. The outcome would be a painful death, with the victim gasping for air. To counteract the inability to breathe, Harvard medical researchers Philip Drinker and Louis Agassiz Short developed an artificial respirator in 1927, which later became known as the iron lung. Iron lung was a type of negative pressure ventilator, which was a mechanical respirator which encloses most of a person's body except head, and varies the air pressure in the enclosed space to stimulate breathing. Polio's primary victims were children under the age of 5, but that doesn't mean adults were immune from the disease. During the summer of 1921, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was enjoying a day of sailing on his yacht when he suddenly fell overboard into the icy waters of the Bay of Fundy, which ironically felt paralyzing to his body. The following day, he complained of lower back pain and went for a swim in hopes to ease the soreness. As the day progressed, he could feel his legs becoming weaker, and by the third day, he could no longer hold his own weight. He was diagnosed with polio. Roosevelt relentlessly pursued every path he could take in his quest to regain the ability to walk, but nothing could cure the condition. In 1926, Warm Springs was having financial issues. As its favorite visitor, Roosevelt couldn't allow the facility to close down. Instead, he bought the facility for $200,000 and transformed it into a rehabilitation center for polio patients like himself. As Roosevelt re-emerged into political life, he kept his disability hidden from the public and never allowed himself to be filmed while in his wheelchair. Fueled by America's good cheer and acceptance, Roosevelt gained substantial confidence in his political career and ran for governor of New York in 1928. He held the governorship for 2 terms until he decided to run for president in the 1932 election and emerged victorious. While Roosevelt decided to focus on his political career despite his paralysis, he never abandoned the fight against polio. He turned to his friend Basil O'Connor to establish the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis in 1938 to accelerate the combat against polio. To raise funds for the foundation, O'Connor came up with a clever plan. Instead of solely seeking large donations from wealthy patrons, he encouraged children to contribute by sending in 10-cent coins. This initiative was dubbed the March of Dime and was incredibly successful. The White House received tens of thousands of letters containing dimes, many of them sent by school children wishing for the recovery of their classmates. The generous donations raised millions of dollars, which were then used to establish specialized treatment centers for polio patients. Additionally, the funds helped families cover the expenses of treatment and acquire necessary equipment such as iron lungs. When Roosevelt addressed Congress in person on the 1st of March 1945, about a month before his death, he made public reference to his disability for almost the first time in 20 years. Following his death in 1945, Roosevelt's tireless efforts in the fight against polio and his contributions to the March of Dimes movement were commemorated by issuing the Roosevelt dime, featuring his face, which remains in circulation to this day. By 1950s, over 80% of polio victims nationwide were receiving funding from the March of Dimes. They also poured millions of dollars into research efforts to develop polio vaccine that would stop the disease once and for all. March of Dime approached Dr. Jonas Salk as they needed help studying the polio virus and offered funding to hire more researchers and enlarge his lab with better equipment. Salk accepted the offer as the outbreak in 1949 and 1952 were the worst ones they've ever seen. There were 58,000 confirmed cases, of which 3,000 died, and more than 22,000 were left with some form of paralysis. Salk met with Basil O'Connor in 1951 and discussed about developing a vaccine. It's important to note that live virus vaccines were the prevailing medical standard during that era. Live virus vaccine, also called an attenuated vaccine, consists of a weakened or modified virus that's able to infect hosts like usual, but is unable to sustain significant enough damage so that the immune system is able to generate antibodies for the wild type of virus. This type of vaccine introduces virus in a safer way and is really effective, but takes a lot of time and research to develop. Outside Salk's team, Dr. Albert Sabin, working at his lab at the Children's Hospital in Cincinnati, was leading the effort to make a vaccine for polio. As the infection and death toll were increasing on a daily basis, O'Connor was suggesting to speed up his process, but Dr. Sabin brushed it off, explaining how time-consuming the research and production will be. Salk, being a genius, proposed using an inactivated form of virus, also called dead virus vaccine. Unlike live virus, dead virus vaccines inject inactive viruses into the body, tricking the immune system into producing antibodies. This type of vaccine could be mass-produced rapidly, in contrast to live virus vaccine. Despite being a possible solution, other researchers were not on common grounds with the idea. Basil O'Connor, on the other hand, was eager to develop any form of vaccine possible, and hence agreed to fund Salk's research. The most terrifying moment for any vaccine are the initial human trials. Salk was able to develop a vaccine that worked for lab animals, and decided to test it on a group of children and adults, including his own family. The vaccine worked and no one got polio. More human trials were conducted with success, and then both Salk and O'Connor were ready to conduct large-scale human trial. Funded by March of Dime, the Francis Field trial involved more than 1.8 million school children across United States, becoming the largest human trial in the medical history of America. The result of the trial was to be published on the 12th of April, 1955, which was the 10th anniversary of the death of President Roosevelt. As polio wasn't confined to America and affected the entire globe, everyone awaited the outcome with bated breath. The trial was a huge success, and everyone celebrated as they finally had a way to completely beat the disease. The vaccine was mass-produced, and the vaccination attempt that followed became one of the largest vaccination movements in human history. Strict regulations and manufacturing procedures were implemented to control the quality of the vaccines. Being vaccinated against polio became a requirement to visit public places and schools. Despite the quality control and strict regulations, a blunder had been made. In what became known as the Qatar incident, few batches of the vaccine manufactured in Qatar laboratories, despite passing required safety tests, contained live polio virus in what was supposed to be an inactivated virus vaccine. This blunder infected thousands of children instead of providing them with immunity. To avoid future instances of similar mishaps, Food and Drug Administration was given the responsibility to regulate the vaccine formula and production methods, which gained the lost trust from the public. Mass production and distribution continued, and the polio cases that had reached 58,000 in 1952 reduced to 161 cases by 1961. In the meantime, trials of the vaccine based on Sabin's version were carried out in the Soviet Union, with important contributions made by Mikhail Chumakov. In 1958, the Soviet Union organized industrial production of this vaccine, and polio was largely eradicated in Eastern Europe and Japan. This success led to trials in the United States and the licensing of Sabin's vaccine in 1961. The vaccine was cheaper than Salk's and easily distributable, which made it the most commonly administered vaccine. Despite both the vaccines working successfully, none of them tried to patent the formula, which would have made billions of dollars in profit. As the formula wasn't patented, this allowed the vaccine to be manufactured and distributed from any corner of the world. With the global scale production and distribution, polio cases were dropped all the way to only 719 cases over the globe by 2000. It was a number worth celebrating, as humanity were clearly winning against the virus and it felt like complete eradication was near. But that wasn't the case. Weirdly, the number of cases started rising up. Few countries became the hotspot for increasing polio cases. India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Nigeria were the only remaining countries where polio was still considered endemic. Specific regions within these countries were controlled by organizations like Boko Haram in Nigeria and Taliban in Afghanistan, who viewed the vaccines as unwanted Western influence. Rumors like the vaccine contains contraceptives to keep women from being pregnant, and inclusion of pork-derived contents in the vaccine became the talk of the town, repelling further resistance to immunization. The problem was solved by the local governments and clerics, allowing vaccinations to resume on the condition that the vaccines be manufactured in Indonesia, a majority Muslim country, and not in the United States. By 2017, the number of active cases had fallen down to 22. but within a few years, new cases of polio started popping up in developed countries as recently as 2022. If you remember well, there were initially two types of vaccines. One was the inactivated vaccine that was injected into the bloodstream, providing immunity outside the digestive system. Another was the live attenuated vaccine, which was given as oral drops and provided protection from within the digestive system. The oral vaccine had weakened virus, which would survive and keep on multiplying itself within the vaccinated individual's digestive system, continuously triggering immune response against polio. If you know a thing or two about virus, they are smart and they can mutate into tougher variants if the situation allows. Oral vaccine was cheap to manufacture and provided long immunity, which was the reason why it was used by majority of the globe, but the vaccine had a flaw that couldn't be ignored. The chances were slim, but the live virus from the oral vaccine could potentially mutate and cause paralytic polio to the vaccinated individual, which was called vaccine-associated polio, or it could simply spread via the oral fecal route to a non-vaccinated individual, just like how polio originally spread. That is exactly what happened in the 21st century, and the polio infections that occurred from this phenomena was given the name vaccine-derived poliovirus. This was possible when the virus is passed from the feces of an OPV-vaccinated person to a non-vaccinated individual. Going back to the emergence of polio in 2022, between February and June, multiple vaccine-like type 2 poliovirus isolates were collected from the London Beckton sewage treatment works. In the case of London sewage, elevated levels of polio were detected which were somewhat genetically related, which means that either it's shedding from a single individual who's been immunocompromised or it's been passed around to multiple individuals. It's important to note that majority of the Western countries used the inactivated virus vaccines to control polio, whereas countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan have been using the oral version. As the flow of immigrants have been increasing, individuals who had been given the oral vaccines might have someone who's been immunocompromised and keeps on shedding the virus through feces. As no outbreaks have been observed till date, it's safe to assume that we won't have another polio pandemic anytime soon. This is the reason why countries with low number of polio cases are suggested to switch to Salk's inactivated virus vaccine. Something similar was also observed in 2022 in New York. The source was found to be a 20-year-old Hungarian traveler residing in Rockland County who had taken the oral form of vaccine. To further fortify the fight against polio, new vaccines were introduced in 2023. But keep in mind that if you've been vaccinated with either the inactivated or oral polio vaccine, you will be completely immune from any type of polio and don't need to worry about these random occurrences. Looking back to the history of polio, it was a major disease whose vaccines are still distributed to newborn babies. With no specific origin to point at, its exact source remains a mystery. The paralyzed individuals who survived severe bodily damage continue to face the consequences. Only 2 of the iron lung users were alive till the start of 2024, and we lost Paul Alexander of Dallas on March 11, 2024, who had been confined to an iron lung for 72 years from the age of 6, longer than anyone, and was the last man living in an iron lung. With his death, Martha Lillard is the only person in the US known to use an iron lung. While it's easy to forget polio as it rarely makes the headline these days, it took millions of lives and left many paralyzed. As of now, among the 3 types of polio, Type 2 was eradicated in 1999 and Type 3 was eradicated in 2020, with only Type 1 remaining in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It is the result of combined worldwide effort that we're this close to getting rid of polio. Random occurrences of traces of polio, like the one in 2022, are expected to occur once in a few years, but as long as you keep yourself immunized and encourage others to do the same, the centuries-old pandemic that's still active will be eradicated pretty soon.